So this presentation is on adverse childhood experiences and opioid use disorder. And it is, I think, our third webinar in our series. And see, let me click it where I can advance. Okay, so here's an outline of the presentation. We're going to talk a little bit about why is this relevant to medication-assisted treatment? Why should we know this information? We'll talk a little bit about the ACE study. I would imagine majority of folks have already heard of the ACE study, but it's fascinating information, and it's important to review and very, very pertinent to our presentation. We'll go over some of the data, and then we'll talk about mechanisms for the transmission of deleterious effects from childhood into adulthood, particularly as it pertains to opioid use disorder. So let's go on to the next slide. So again, kind of talking about the relevance. Why are we talking about this in this context? Well, the first thing is that opioid use disorder is something that carries a lot of stigma with it, and it's really relevant for those folks that are want to do medication-assisted treatment to be able to look at the stigma and some of the negative stereotypes that go along with opioid use disorder and dispel them. So that's one of the main reasons that we're going over this information. And it is going to be a lot of science, so I'm going to apologize ahead of time, but there's a good reason for that, and that is just to help everyone know that that the role of trauma is very, very well established in the etiology of substance use disorders. With respect to stigma, sometimes some of the statements that people either say or probably more often just think to themselves is people choose to be addicts. As we're going through the data, kind of keep that in mind. Some people, have the philosophy that having a bad childhood, is not an excuse for bad behavior, or they believe that that assertion, having a bad childhood, as an excuse for bad behavior is faulty, and a lot of this has to do with just the philosophy of society. And my dad used to say, and my dad is, he's a compassionate guy, but carries some of the old school philosophies with him, and he used to talk about someone's got claiming that they struggle in life because someone took away their lollipop in childhood, and it's not that. It's we're talking about things that are traumas that are very significant and have a tremendous negative effect on people later on, and again, we're going to get to that. Another thing that we see in the clinic is that this belief that people who are opioid use disorders are inherently dishonest, and that they're even sociopathic. And as criminals, they should be treated like criminals, and those are all significant barriers to having a good, effective medication-assisted treatment program. So with all that, eliminating the stigma is the end result of that, hopefully, is to be able to treat people with opioid use disorder with compassion and respect. And then this presentation is going to be a prelude to further presentations on stigma, with a little bit more heavy emphasis on some case presentations. And then we're going to have a presentation on historical trauma, as well as it factors in as an etiologic factor. All right, next. So let's dive into the ACE study. So it began in San Diego in the 1980s. There was a doctor, Dr. Vincent Folletti, who was an internist, and he ran an obesity clinic for Kaiser Permanente in the San Diego area. And he found a couple of things. Number one, that in the obesity group, there was a very high dropout rate. And then he also found that even for those people who completed their obesity group, and I forgot the length of it, I think it was around 3 months, that frequently these folks would relapse almost immediately in terms of their eating behavior and be back within a few months. And this was frustrating, you know, from a clinician's standpoint, but also really made him curious about what the reasons might be for that. And so one of the things that he did is he began to take very careful histories of folks that were in the obesity group, and he studied a few hundred, his investigation into the etiologies revealed that folks that had dropped out or relapsed had very, very high rates of sexual abuse in childhood, as well as other childhood abuses, physical, emotional, etc. So with this data, he presented this at obesity conferences, and there wasn't a whole lot of interest at the time. And a big reason for that was that people really couldn't wrap their mind around the fact that there were so many folks out there that had been abused as children. You know, it's from a societal perspective, it's one of those things that is not talked about, and there hadn't been a whole lot of research prior to that on the prevalence of child abuse, and some of that came in the 1990s, late 80s, 1990s, with the guy did hundreds or dozens of studies, Dr. Finkelhor, but this was prior to that. So finally, Dr. Folletti got someone to listen to him, and he was hooked up with the Centers for Disease Control, who they were convinced to take a look at this, and this time they studied everyone in the or every adult in the Kaiser Permanente system in San Diego County. And what they found was not only those correlations between obesity and childhood abuse, but they also found significant correlations between childhood trauma and problems with mental health, health behaviors, including addictions, smoking, so forth, and then several disease states, medical disease states, to include obesity, diabetes, ischemic heart disease, cerebrovascular disease, COPD, and even cancer. This was a fairly geographically defined group, so that was an initial criticism of the study, and rightly so, but this study has been replicated dozens, if not hundreds of times around the world, and in different populations of all different types of socioeconomic strata. So what is the ACE study, what are adverse childhood experiences. So this is the ACE questionnaire, and basically it breaks down into a couple of categories. Number one, the classic childhood abuse categories. And then there's a parental neglect category, and another category that's really kind of can be classified as household dysfunction. So there's 10, by the way. A couple of things, general features of adverse childhood experiences is that they tend to cluster. They've found that if a person has one or two, then they are more likely, or that if person has one, then they're more likely to have other ones, and that kind of makes sense. You know, if someone is in a dysfunctional household, you know, there's likely going to be, you know, not only emotional abuse but maybe physical abuse. You know, if there's parental separation, that there's going to be another one, and that's what we in fact find in the literature. And this is a little bit of a busy slide, but basically the main point is that if you look at the right-hand side of each of these graphs, you see people with 4 adverse childhood experiences, and the prevalence of that is about the prevalence, actual prevalence of that is about 12%, which if you just predict it by chance, kind of there being no relationship between any of the variables, then it would be around 2%. So it demonstrates that principle that if a person's going to have one, they're going to have 2 or 3 and so forth. There's also another general characteristic about adverse childhood experiences, and we found this to be true in the case of most of the outcomes that have been seen, but this one demonstrates it pretty well, and that's a graded dose response. So the higher number of adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, that someone has, of course, the greater the risk is for the bad outcome, in this case, suicide attempts. But not only that, is that it's not just additive, it's not linear, it's beyond linear, where, as you can see, people with 7 or more have about a 24 time greater risk of suicide attempts than the general population, which is really startling. So ACEs have been studied in terms of a number of different outcomes. They kind of can be grouped into chronic diseases, health risk behaviors, mental health conditions, and social outcomes. And I'll just go over a few for each. First one, chronic disease. As you can see, we have ischemic heart disease, hepatic disease, and cancer. And as the number of ACEs increases, the risk of those conditions increases as well. And hepatic disease obviously is more linked than others, which kind of makes sense when you consider some of the other conditions that are associated with a greater number of ACEs. Health behaviors, and really this kind of explains a lot of the health or the hepatic disease prevalence. So I just wanted to draw your attention to that the right-hand side of this graph, people with 4 ACEs. And as you can see, the odds ratio of having either an alcohol use disorder or IV drug use disorder, and that's both opioids as well as methamphetamine, are over 10. So that's very, very high rate, very high risk with folks with ACEs and in that particular health, those particular health behaviors. Mental health conditions, you can see depression and suicide. Again, you see that graded dose response with 4 people with 4 ACEs having, odds ratio of over 10 times more likely to attempt suicide than other folks. Social function, as you might expect, if it's going to have that profound of an effect on mental health and other conditions, it may have an effect on people's social functions, and as a matter of fact, it does. As you can see, the rates of joblessness with folks with 4 or more ACEs is 3.5 times the average population, and about 8 times for homelessness as an outcome for folks with ACEs. So what are the mechanisms for this phenomenon? How is it that exposure to trauma has these very long-lasting consequences for folks? Well, there's a number of different theories on the cause, and I'll just kind of tell you right now, all of them are true to some extent. So there's a developmental biopsychosocial effect. You can look at it from the standpoint of disrupted attachments. There's hard neurophysiologic substrates involved, and then finally there's some epigenetic mechanisms. And so this is that developmental piece. And as you can see at the bottom, this is by the way, this is a pyramid that was developed by Dr. Folletti and his colleagues in the early 90s. And this was kind of the way they conceptualized the course of folks with ACEs. And so you have the adverse childhood experiences at the bottom, which causes impairments, which then causes adoption of health risk behaviors. And so smoking, leads to COPD and lung cancer and so forth. And they ultimately lead to early death. By the way, the scientific gaps that are on the right side of that pyramid, those existed in the early 90s when this pyramid was first developed, but some of those have been cleared up with the epigenetic data that I'm going to be describing. So, so we talked about developmental a little. So talking about disrupted attachments as an etiology or as a mechanism for transmitting deleterious effects of childhood abuse or neglect into adulthood. So one of the first indications that attachment may affect behavior later in life was noticed hundreds of years ago, actually probably about 170 years ago. I think it was early to mid 1800s. There was a Royal Navy surgeon who, between treating scurvy and doing amputations and so forth, he noticed a correlation between sailors who were not breastfed and a higher rate of alcohol use disorder. and he was just investigating why there were so many sailors that drank, and in the course of investigating this, he found this correlation, and it was about double. So that was the correlation that he found about double. There have been some animal studies on neglect and later social dysfunction. It was demonstrated by some famous experiments by Harry Harlow. In the 50s and 60s, he used rhesus monkeys to demonstrate the effect of neglect on a primate. In one of the famous studies, he took a monkey, a baby rhesus monkey, separated it from its mother at birth, and then put the monkey in a cage with two different surrogate mothers. One of the surrogate mothers was furry, but it had no food. The other surrogate mother was a wire mesh, but it had some food, and I'm going to show you a little clip of that. One of the other famous experiments is that he took a baby primate monkey, or baby rhesus monkey, away from not only his mother, but also his peers for periods of 3, 6, 9 months. And what they found is that at 6 months of isolation, a rhesus monkey, their social functioning would be totally disrupted and impaired. So they took the monkey away from everyone, put him in isolation, introduced him back into a group of other peers, maybe siblings, other rhesus monkeys in the colony, and found that the isolated monkey just could not get along with other monkeys, was highly reactive, didn't understand social cues, and lots of times ended up being ostracized, and some of them got depressed and ended up, and most of them died early. So I'm going to do just a little clip. This is of that first
newborn rhesus monkeys will grow up not in accordance with nature, but in the controlled atmosphere of the
in the interest of time,
influences of childhood.
I am going to.
In a classic continuing study, infant monkeys are removed from the mother at birth and raised in semi-isolation.
Let me. Oh darn it! All right, I was gonna.
Other individuals can be seen and
I was going to fast forward it.
But there's no physical contact, no interaction. Mother is a bit of plastic and shaggy cloth, a doll with no life of its own, but capable of nourishing the life of an infant.
I'm going to make it smaller, and so just in the interest of time, I want to fast forward it to the end. Towards the end. Okay, so this is the baby monkey separated from mother. As you can see, he's emotionally unstable.
The young monkey is placed deliberately on a cloth mother which has no milk to nourish him, but fulfills some fundamental needs. This experiment revolves around one simple question. Will the infant monkey switch his affection to a wire mother which offers food and life itself?
So I'll just tell you what happened with that baby monkey, and basically it spent 23 plus hours on the furry mother monkey for comfort versus a half hour or less at the nutrition surrogate mother, and almost to the point of malnutrition. Just that's kind of demonstrating the importance of attachment to primates and particularly human beings. So so we talked about developmental perspective and attachment mechanisms for ACEs, and moving on to the neurophysiologic component. First, the young brain is highly vulnerable, and abuse at early ages can just have profound effects because of the vulnerability of the young brain. At birth, a human brain has 1 trillion connections. By 1 year, it's got 100 billion. Neurons. By 1 year, it's got 100 billion neurons. So there's a lot of what we call pruning. A lot of neurons die off and they reorganize. And as you can see in that second bullet, 1 million neural connections per second occur. They're forming, dissolving, reforming. For that first year, it's just tremendously complex, the neural organization that occur at that time. Just to talk a little bit about the effect of abuse and neglect on the young child, and looking at it from an imaging perspective, the Romanian orphan study. For those of you who either too young or haven't read about it, it was in the early 1990s, late 80s, when the Soviet Union fell. There was a time of social unrest in Romania. There were a fair number of folks that died in some of the fighting, and a lot of very young orphans were created, and they didn't have the social infrastructure to take care of that. So they end up housing infants and very young children, and it was assumed at that point that was going to be bad for them, but they didn't quite know how bad it would be. And this is an imaging study. This is an axial plane shot it's a PET scan at the same level in both cases. On the left is a healthy 3-year-old, and as you can see in those ovals, there's a lot of activity in the prefrontal cortex, which helps emotionally regulate an organism, and helps people to calm themselves down and make sense of what's going on around them. Compare that to the Romanian orphan at the same age, 3 years old, and you can see that there's very little activity in the prefrontal cortex, and this is part of the explanations why these folks had such a difficult time. And it's been, some of these folks are in their 30s and 40s, and a lot of them had very, very bad outcomes. There was a very precise volumetric MRI study done, and they found a number of brain structures that were affected by child abuse. So they found global volume of the brain. They found diminution of the prefrontal cortex, hippocampus, the amygdala, which is enormously important for as a center for processing, emotional processing and fear. Corpus callosum, anterior cingulate cortex, and cerebellum. So lots of the very important structures in the brain have been found to be affected by child abuse. Lastly, in our discussion of etiologies, the epigenetics and adverse childhood experiences, and these are some of the gaps that that Dr. Folletti had noticed early on. We found that there's stress-mediated modifications, epigenetic modifications that occur with numerous genes, which encode for important proteins in numerous organ systems. Of course, in this case, we're thinking mostly about the brain. And this modification includes alteration of histones and DNA methylation and acetylation. These changes tend to be long-lasting. And you don't have to remember the methylation part, but basically that the genes which encode for protein are disrupted. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those genes and why they're important. So the most highly studied genetic abnormalities have been found in the HPA, the hypothalamic pituitary axis, basically your cortisol system. But there's also other modifications that have been found in other neurotransmitters and proteins in the brain. Again, the most studied one has been the HPA axis. And they found that that DNA methylation of the cortisol receptor gene is a major cause of problems. The cortisol receptor is distributed throughout the body, and most notably in the hippocampus, amygdala, and prefrontal cortex, all structures which deal with memory and emotional processing, emotional reasoning, those kinds of things. Basically the effect of the epigenetic modifications is to decrease the expression of the gene to disrupt basically it decreases the effectiveness of the receptor, which in turn increases the levels of circulating cortisol, which has a whole host of negative effects in folks, and I won't read them all, but it basically destroys nerve cells through multiple mechanisms. There's also other proteins that are important for neural development that have been found to be affected by stress through epigenetic modification. Those include brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and they've further connected these with some of the mental health conditions, the common ones. Oxytocin receptor gene, that's oxytocin. Oxytocin is very important in mediating stress and in early life attachments. And they've done studies and shown that folks with a history of neglect and or abuse have higher levels of methylation of the oxytocin receptor gene. And finally, serotonin transmitter gene epigenetic modification. It was found that the serotonin transmitter polymorphism, so changes in this transporter led to dysfunction and was therefore a risk factor in depression. And they've basically found that it's due to the epigenetic modification of the gene that codes for serotonin transporter. And there have been studies that have shown correlations, again, with childhood maltreatment, methylation of the transporter for serotonin and decreased fMRI, hippocampal activity, and depression. So all four of those variables are found to be related. So, so you have the epigenetic mediated neural dysfunction. What does that mean? And what role does that have in the development of substance use disorders? Well, self-medication is frequently stated as a reason for initiation of substance abuse in adolescence. I'm not sure what the percentage is, but I find it to be an enormously frequent reason that folks cite for beginning to use substances in adolescence. They've done some sequencing studies in mental health and substance use conditions, kind of looking at what comes first. Is it the substance abuse that causes the mental health, or the mental health conditions that cause the substance use disorders? And for some, it's bidirectional. Depression, it seems that sometimes depression comes first before the substance use disorder. Sometimes it's the substance use disorder comes first and then the depression. But there have been a number of conditions where it's usually that social phobia, PTSD, trauma-related conditions come first, and then a substance use disorder follows. Kind of honing in more on prevalence of trauma in opioid use disorder populations. There was a study of adolescent outpatients with opioid use disorder, and they showed about 86% of those in treatment had significant childhood traumas, and that's compared to 55% with for other substances. So there's something about opioid use disorder which seems to be even more linked to childhood trauma than other abuse of other substances. And the N on this was several hundred. I forgot exactly how many, but it was several hundred. The study is there. There was another study of adults with opioid use disorder that were participating in drug trials. And so they, in the course of doing the research for the drug trials, they, took very careful histories, and they showed a rate of about 90% of significant childhood trauma in adults that abuse opiates. Okay. All right, let me, is that it? I had, all right. See if I can get that. Okay. So again, kind of going back to the relevance of all this, it is, trauma is a very convincing etiology for the development of particularly opioid disorders. It's not the only one. There's genetic factors, but it's very highly linked. Opioid use disorders are very highly linked to childhood trauma, and that really, I think, says something about how we should view folks with opioid use disorders. They're folks that have suffered a lot in life, that have, probably have other conditions, co-occurring mental health conditions. A lot of times they've got health problems, and really they really need compassionate, kind treatment from from the health system. And that's really a crucial component of medication-assisted treatment program is that you use a trauma-informed approach. Let's see, I think I've got a slide on that. And again, some of you guys may have heard about trauma-informed care. There's a fair amount of talk about it in ambulatory care settings, which is fantastic. And the idea is that in light of the high prevalence of trauma in clinical populations, not just in substance use disorders, but also in just health conditions and mental health conditions, trauma-informed care should be kind of like universal precautions. It should be so with universal precautions, you just kind of glove up whenever you deal with body fluids, and that way you're not trying to figure out who's at risk and so forth. We found out 20 years ago that it's hard to predict. So similarly, trauma-informed care basically is an approach where you treat everyone who's there with the utmost of respect, including those folks with opioid use disorders. It puts a premium, kind of what is it? It puts a premium on patient-centeredness, respect, good communication, a belief that the patient is doing best with their current knowledge and their circumstances, and most important, show kindness. SAMHSA's got a free manual online. It's TIP 57 or Treatment Improvement Protocol 57, and you can just download it, print it out. It's in the public domain. So that's it for the presentations. Let's see, let's go ahead and we can open it up to questions. I already have a question. Are we going to make these PowerPoints available after the presentation? Yes, both the PowerPoint as well as the recording is going to be available. So yeah, either one or both. I just a kind of a more experiential view on this. The 80 to 90% prevalence of significant childhood trauma certainly resonates with my experience of working with folks in medication-assisted treatment. A lot of these folks are, they're good folks that got themselves involved in a bad problem, and a lot of times it was they were dealing with overwhelming distress and began self-medicating. It's important, kind of going back to one of my previous slides, it's important to assess for co-occurring conditions, because those are frequently part of the picture. I thought about doing a case presentation, but because it is the prevalence is so incredibly high, the prevalence of childhood trauma history is so high in folks with opioid use disorder, it's hard to pick someone out because it's really the rule rather than the exception. I can say that I do get patients that are transfers from other providers that were, either treated with disrespect or kind of treated as a widget, or there was some sort of misunderstanding, so there's really a need out there for that compassionate care, and that's not always found